but today might be more of a kind of a genealogy, okay? So when I was a graduate student, I came back to graduate school to do a PhD in, well, I attempted to do a PhD between, let's say, complet and mathematics, and there was nobody who could actually supervise that. So I cobbled something together. And it started with this question after having worked for many years with computers, but really I was trained in mathematics, pure math, right? It was really frustrating because the question that I had was, how come computers were so useless for doing mathematics? Actually, completely useless, as far as I could see, and useless also to my friends who are doing work in who are poets and who are writers, and also useless to people who are political activists. So these are the communities that I actually circulated in the 90s. But you know, it was my work to be one of the pioneers in inventing and creating new kinds of software for these machines that later became known as the Macintosh. So I was the first generation of such kids to do that. It was great fun. We got to pick and choose the kinds of things we did. So that was very strange. On the one hand, we were creating the kinds of technologies that people now see as whatever, you know, this and that kind of thing. But at that point, you know, we could actually define what those genres were. So then went back into the PhD between philosophy, computer science, and math. So, and then after that, I thought, well, maybe there were 2 or 3 people who could read that dissertation. That's it. So 2 or 3 people, maybe if we're lucky 5. That's it. So I thought I would try to do something different with the same questions, because I thought, well, what seemed to be much more informative, what helped me understand this question, wasn't from logic or symbolic algebra or even studies in diagrammatic reasoning, but more looking at, for example, Husserl's first essay on intuition, his own first essays on geometry, for example, or people who are writing about technologies of writing, looking at the history of technologies of writing, and, for example. So that was much more interesting. Or people who are taking anthropological studies, doing anthropological studies of laboratory life. So that was more informative, more helpful. Then, so I decided to try to do something involving try to take an empirical approach to this question, why computers seem to be so useless for doing creative work in conjecturing and proving mathematics, fresh mathematics, contemporary mathematics on one hand, or to do anything having to do with, say, expressive poetic work. And trying to be also constructive, I also wanted to find alternative ways to use computational methods that would be creative, could provide scope for gesture and nuance, and even for very rigorous thought that have nothing to do with calculation, for example. So anyway, so I decided to start a laboratory called the Topological Media Lab. It was kind of a dig at the other media lab, and basically using computers, but completely differently. The first machine we bought was a sewing machine at Georgia Tech. And they asked me, why did you buy a sewing machine? You're a media lab. I said, well. And after some years of that kind of question, I would say, for example, well, we're trying to do new kinds of mathematics. It happens to be working with dancers and musicians, and we're doing mathematics, a kind of mathematical thinking with it. And I would say, even mathematical gesture is not always cognitive. A mathematician might be making gesture with a piece of chalk, but that's not a cognitive act. And then my colleagues work from cognitive science to say everything is a cognitive act. So I left. I went to Canada. So I accepted this chair in media arts and sciences. It was the first CRC in media arts and sciences. And I started to teach insight design and computational sciences. Then I went to ASU after 10 years, a lot of fun with the TML, and I'll show you work today. I decided to go back to the States, and now I'm kind of debating whether that was a good move or not. But anyway, I went back to the States, having a lot of support. This work needs to thank the government of Canada, Quebec, the province of Quebec, about 120 wonderful artists, engineers, researchers, philosophers who have passed through the Topological Media Lab. It's part of a network of artists and thinkers around in different countries. So I want to credit all these people. I decided to go back to the States in 2014 to see if I could amplify some of that really free work, in a sense, fusion work, alchemical work, to leverage the power of a Yankee university, one of the most dynamic ones in America today, ASU, okay, to see how I could actually bring some of that work back into contact with the practical arts, such as design and architecture. So here I am. So I'm going to show you some of the work. Okay, let's see what you think. Compare notes. One motivating, maybe I can I stand? Motivate the laboratory was, how can we build or make technologies or techniques that involve technologies not to complicate environments, but to enrich environments, to build environments that are richer. Okay, build an environment, enriching them. When most of the time when we use technologies, this is the polemical part, it actually makes our life more complicated. So do we have sound for this? Now we do. That's me. This is a low-tech response to my question by one of my students. So this is the entry to our building in Montreal, for one of the main metros in Montreal. And I asked them this question: how can we enrich the environment? We have all these tools, you know, all these real-time media tools, and you will see them. But I also said, but first, think about what you want to do to the environment with no electricity. No electricity. And then I'll give you electricity if you still can't do what you need to do. And then if you still can't do what you need to do, I'll give you a computer, in that order. Okay? So these people were very clever, came up with this low tech. So it's one of my favorite experiments. So more recently, jump 10 years, we did go ahead, of course, and invent some techniques. And I'm going to not show you everything, but just give you a little thread to give you a sense of the scope. The general question is, can we generate knowledge? All right. So it's not about making art. It's about using all these different techniques that are available from, let's say, arts and engineering to pursue certain questions, which in maybe another century might be considered philosophical questions. Okay, and we'll see what some of those are. So that's why I say maybe, this is conjecture, maybe these modes of making knowledge could be construed either as ars nova or a new science, new kinds of science. And this is after 15 years. I did not claim this at the beginning. It's after 15 years, I begin to ask this question, okay? It's based on a lot of work. So for example, as just a little appetizer, some of the work in this kind of responsive environment, what's called responsive environment, let's see that one, would, for example, think about modeling what you see in here, not with just a programmer making up the movement, but let's do the next one. Underneath, using the dynamics and using, let's say, weather systems as a source of the dynamics. So the body's gestures and movements, the way the foot pressures on the floor, the sound it makes, is then given to a simulation of material, media, that actually uses, quote, the real physics, so to speak. Let's say Navier-Stokes equations for smoke or water or ice, so in this case, the pressure and the humidity of air, which is then modeled to represent, for example, the forming of a storm. And then bring it back, not in the literal way, okay? At the same time, as you see over here, we also use all the techniques of theater. So moving lights and lighting systems, which are controlled or modulated, I should say, by the movements of the body, or of gesture, voice, what have you. So it's agnostic as to the sensing method. It could be using a camera, it could be using a pressure on the body or whatever. So for 15 years, we've used all sorts of ways of sensing movement. In the course of trying to understand how people work with gesture, more in the performative domain, we have worked with people from moving arts, dancers, musicians, performers, but again, not to make performance. It's not for the purpose of making art. You can't say that often enough. But the techniques are at the highest level of the arts. So the best people who are able to bring those skills to this kind of thing. So in this case, we did also once in a while make works that look like art in that context. So in this case, after a series of years of seminars on digital life, which we'll describe later on, we decided to expose some of that in the form of a choreographed work. And this is a rehearsal for that. And then finally, more recently in Paris, in the Musée des Arts et Métiers, with Barbara Formas's group called Espace, which is about aesthetics. We did an intervention in a public space, more architectural, and I can talk about it another time. But most importantly, it has to do with taking the rhythms that are the rhythms of the movement of people in a common space, like a rotunda, and refracting it, selecting out using computer vision techniques only certain aspects, certain kinds of rhythm, or certain delays in time. The movements from maybe 5 seconds ago, or the movements from 30 milliseconds ago, or the movements that had to be legato, or the movements that happened to be like more jerky. Those are extracted out from the video, and those are parts with palimpsests back together again in a painterly fashion. So that's called time lenses. Okay, so they're very different, but that could be inverted and used as not as a work of art, installation art, but used as apparatuses for studying our sense of rhythm. So the very same technology is used double in a generous way. One, to the public can be shown as installation, but the real interest is to take all that skilled work and use it to make apparatuses for studying time or temporality and rhythm. Okay? So that's a lot of work. Okay, now what about the politics? Another motivation for this kind of way of doing things, because I was working 20 years ago with artists in a kind of more an anarchist way, and we retained all these friendships. But I decided to do this work in the university because of this. This is a caricature, all right? But oftentimes we have who's we? I would say, let's say if we're working as a historian of science or historian of technology or philosopher of technology or literary theorist, etc., we have or an artist, we have a downstream relationship to technology. I was just talking to Benjamin. Where's Benjamin? See? Okay, right. We're just talking about this, right? Let's say downstream approach, or I could say cargo cult, even more funny, cargo cult attitude or relationship to technology. So somebody gives me, let's say my student gets seeded the next new phone, and they say, hey, you make something cool with this, right? So then we make art with the given. So this kind of downstream approach. But another kind of more symmetrical approach might be to be all at the table at the same time. This is what Benjamin was just saying, right? So in this magma, we have a conversation. I have a speculative conversation about what if, fourth world, right? What if the world were such that, this kind of thing. So that's why I say not engineering, but engineering research. Because engineers actually can do incredibly speculative work. They have that expertise to do that work, right? They're not in the university to do engineering. They're in the university to do actually speculation with engineering, right? So this is ancient. So that's why I call it's an amodern practice, not a modern practice. Actually, that's why it's not a modern practice. It's a fusion of practices, right? Which has been done centuries ago. Right, the making of a cathedral. This is the Duomo of Firenze. The making of a cathedral is a perfect example of this kind of practice. And it was not done by individual artists, it's done by collectives, ateliers. So synthesis, and also its precursor, the Topological Media Lab, is consciously constructed based on those kinds of amodern models. This is where history of science and technology is extremely helpful, has been extremely helpful to inform this institutional experiment. How can we construct an organism inside the modern academy, right? That's it, okay, that has to function inside the given economy, right? In such and such a way. So as a director, you play various games, right? You have to be authentic in what you do. You have to be authentic to also the people who are, or institutions that are sponsoring you, right? And I say this to the artists who are coming in, say, in Canada, which is very, very generous, actually, for what Quebec and Canada has called recherche création, right? Research creation. So, as some of you are from or based in Canada, right? So you know this, right? So it's still different. I think what Canadian funding agencies characterize as research creation is not the same as arts-based research or practice-based research, I think, as we hear it in the UK or maybe some parts of Europe, and certainly not in the United States. It's interesting. That difference is very useful, okay? But my own take on this, having been in Hexagram for these years in Montreal, and having had that kind of the luxury, not luxury, the privilege of defining what it might be, what it might mean, is I did want to focus on research, though. That is, it's not for making art. It's not just so that artists in Canada can get more money to buy more computers, to hire more hands, to execute and fabricate their work. Okay? As it turned out, it didn't actually create more better work. It created more work, yes, okay. But the extra promise is, and should be, I think, to create knowledge that's not just my own hermetic knowledge to help me make my work, which is what oftentimes counts as research, let's say, to learn enough to make the work. And you can do very profound research, let's say for Bill Viola or something like that. But to create portable knowledge, knowledge that insights that could only have been derived this way using these techniques and doing this kind of arts-based work, but that somebody else could pick up and use for a purpose that might be entirely or pretty much different and independent of my purpose. Okay, and it should be done in some durable format. I mean, it should be disseminated in some durable format. Usually it's writing, doesn't have to be. Okay, so that's why, we won't go through this diagram, but really the key thing, if you have time later on to look at it, is very carefully, the thematic areas are very carefully designed, or not designed, described, so they really are transversal, okay? Okay, we can talk about it maybe tomorrow. Typical products would be, of course, people, students, right? People come through and they leave transformed, okay? So, but it could also be techniques, right? Could be techniques, ways of thinking, ways of making, ways of moving also, ways of coordinating activity, all right? So maybe in a more memorable form, we can maybe more compactly describe this by kind of a pairing. Because looking at the Latin root for both experience and experiment, it's the same root, which means the root would be the word that means both to experience and to try, So this is a wonderful etymology to leverage. In fact, this also does not just describe my own labs, it also describes the entire school. Now I should put my other hat on as director of the School of Arts, Media, and Engineering. And when they hired me, I said, we all thought this is a terrible name for a program. Just like 3 terms that really don't usually belong together, or maybe some do, so it doesn't mean much. Over 3 years with the faculty, we've been thinking, so what really is this all about? Because there's some people coming from degrees in English from Stanford University doing digital humanities, somebody else coming with somatic training in Feldenkrais as a choreographer, dancer, somebody else who's coming from philosophy of technology with an interest in Whitehead and Simondon. You know, what are we all doing in one department where we all have tenure homes in this one department? What is this department, right? So basically, and it's not me, it's from 10 years of prior work. You can find it in the papers published by some of the more visionary members, founders of that program. It's about experience, yes, but it's experimental study of experience. So it's not just observational. Because we could do that as a historian, right? Could do that as a psychologist, but this would be experimental, so one changes the conditions of experience. So of course this carries a grave, not just a grave ethical responsibility, how to do it in a decent way. And the other is if we want to do experimental work, okay, in that sense, how can we do it experientially? All right, so it's not going to be something like to caricature or something else. Like if you do let's say acoustic experiment. A psychoacoustic experiment could be something where you put some, pitches in one ear and different pitches in a different ear, and you just make that the percept, and you have the subject raise her hand or whatever at the right moments. Okay, but that is a very clean situation, and you isolate all the phenomena to just one item, right? So if you want to be experiential, we need to be able to think of thick and dense situations. They may not be, quote, realistic, but they should be thick and dense. Okay? So, okay. Okay? Nobody's yelling at me and shouting. This is all fine, right? It's all fine. Yeah, but we're actually trying it, That all sounds good. Okay, so this is a kind of a backward look at how this is not, how do you say, this is retrospective, all right? So everything seems, so easy, it's after retrospective. So it seems to work like this. So practical questions coming from, let's say, interactive media arts. And I said, we don't do interactive arts, okay, but just for a moment, I can explain. Well, we talked about this in the class, okay, why I wouldn't, we'll prefer the word responsive rather than interaction. A practical question would be, if you're talking about interaction design, it might be, let's say, I wave my hand close to this lamp, and it should just turn off or turn on, right? But maybe I didn't mean that. I just was gesticulating, and it turns off. So, I don't want that to happen, right? It wasn't my intention, but it's programmed, it's sensor, not all the careful engineering to do that. So then the engineer will say, well, I'll make it better. So how do you indicate your intention? And this happened with very rich responsive environments that we built in 2000, 2001, which are much more complicated in this situation. So live, whole body, lots of people in the room. We built it with video projected over a like 40-foot wide circus. It was amazing. Okay, so in such complicated situations, it's even harder. And I said to my colleagues who were asking this question, well, can't you tell us some criteria by which the computer will know what to do? I said, well, not even humans can do that. It's hard even for humans to ascertain that. This is a philosophical problem. It's not a kinetic problem. It's not even a psychological problem. It's a philosophical problem. How does one entity know the intent of another entity? This is the hard problem of consciousness. It's harder than you think. And if we haven't solved this, if philosophers have not, quote, solved this problem in 2,000 years, maybe the engineers should be a little bit more modest in our expectation, right? It's very useful sometimes to indicate or to have an understanding of how difficult some problems really are, right? Especially in a country where we're supposed to be, problem solvers. So anyway, Patrice Mandelier has written very well on problematic, and it's a little article on radical philosophy in English. So some practical questions like that. So some specific practical questions like that can generate technical questions. Okay, are there then correlates, not certificates of intention? I should say volition. Okay. So are there any statistical measures of gesture, movement, tone of voice, what have you, okay, that are good enough? So that becomes a technical question, all right? But if we want to, we can then really drill down and it becomes a philosophical inquiry, okay? So an example of that was gesture. So for example, by now, after 15 years, it's very common to have gestural interaction. Right here. Okay, 20 years, maybe more of research. Now we have the iPhone. But how many gestures can we do with this? What, 5, 20 at most? Ka, that's it, this, okay? So it's kind of silly, not silly, but it's kind of sad that after so many years of work, that's all we get, right, for gesture. Look at all the gestures we're making. What about all that stuff? So the topological media that was set up to study gesture in all its messiness and density, okay? And in fact, okay, well, we'll get there. So, so that's why they become, okay, I'll say it. That's why they become philosophical questions, because you can say, what is a gesture? What is a gesture, right? Barbara Formius I just came from Paris from this Gesture That Matters symposium organized at the AUP. And in the introduction, Barbara Formius wrote in the introduction a reference, a quote from Agamben, which is a very nice essay that we did in our own seminar too on gesture, where Agamben characterized gesture as means without an end. Very nice way to put it, okay? And then another would be Morse Peckham, the American pragmatist or literary scholar from the 20th century, who said about signs what I actually said about gesture, which is the following. The meaning of a sign is in its response. So I said the same thing about gesture in my laboratory. So the meaning of the gesture is not going to be anything that we can detect from looking at the gesture. Okay? It's going to be in its response, the response made to the gesture by the world. And I don't even say what in the world. It's not necessarily a human. Okay? So that ups the stakes for this kind of gestural technologies. Okay? Anyway, that's the way we were talking about stuff over these years. So, which means it takes time for people to engage in this kind of practice. People are making things and learning how to bring in all the skills that people have. And we expect people to have already finished the coursework, so have a métier, have a skill, and then come in. Okay, either as a composer or as a programmer of maximum speed jitter or something. And then they get attracted to making something very enchanted in some way, okay? But then along the way, the people are shoulder to shoulder with other people who are reading or writing and doing these kinds of questions. And then sometimes they start to cross. And that takes years and years, usually longer than the course of study, which is a big challenge, okay? Okay, we can pass on. Now I'm going to show you some projects, okay, to give you some more specificity and granularity. Is that okay? All right. So we already saw some of these. Actually, yes, I'll repeat. Okay. Top right. Oh, top left, that one. Okay. Yes, they are dancers. One of them is a computer science student who was trained in the Indian dance before she came to the CS program. Okay. And with these people, with these students, what we were interested in was correlation. Is when is a set of movement among bodies one gesture, and when is a set of movement uncorrelated, independent, so to speak. So it could be people cooking. So it could be dinner time, and somebody's stirring a pot of sauce, and somebody's on the phone, somebody else is playing a game, and they're in the same room, and they're just doing their own thing, or in some sense, they're in sync. When there's no homologue, there's no morphological homology, isomorphism between movements, and yet you say, hey, they're in sync. How is that? How could that be? Or it could be intentional, and yet they're doing completely different things. So that was the question, it's correlation. And maybe the correlation doesn't have to be with anything to do with the shape of the body or the location of the hand. Instead, here the conjecture was, maybe we should be attentive to which way parts of the body are facing. Is the shoulder facing that way, and while the chin is facing this way, and the hand's facing that way? And we should be looking not at exactly which way they're facing, but when changes happen. So if I go like this, everybody looks this way. So everybody's looking in a different direction, but we're all changing our heads to more that way at the same time. It doesn't have to be at the same time. correlation does not have to be at the same time. So this is a more subtle, in several dimensions, it's a more subtle approach to the understanding of synchrony. Okay, this is an example. And we built hardware, special sensors, which are set up to detect orientation. And we also, graduate student invented a set of mathematical procedures to calculate the correlation of quaternions. And he's not a mathematician. He was a very smart composer who could program very well. But he could read the mathematical papers, working next to our electrical engineering PhDs. Okay, so it gives you a sense of the verticality of the skills that are needed in the way to pursue this question. Okay? So it's not DIY art at all. Okay, not like that. So let's keep going. I'll pass by these details because I'm going to talk about more of that tomorrow. Some of it has to do with application of design. This is James Terrell's piece happening on campus. And I can pass by that piece. Okay. Some other example. Now, it doesn't have to be dancers. So this is there sound? Okay. This is a graduate student with her, it's her son, okay? It's her own baby. And it was just cameras looking at the scene. Maybe I should tell you first what, it's a camera looking at the scene, so they're not wearing anything, okay? It's just unencumbered as much as possible. And we're interested in, as many times, in improvisation, free invention of meaningful movement, meaningful to oneself or to a collective at that point. So we built these systems where it would provide instantly, in real time, highly textured sounds with some significances to them. But it could be everything could be varied on the fly, okay? And so Navid Avab, who is at that point the main real-time sound artist and programmer, was playing with us. He was just changing the parameters of the real-time sound synthesis system as we were just talking with each other, and she brought in her baby. So I knew that he was going to be, the sound system was responsive to the gesture. And you'll see that I didn't know what he was going to do. So he started changing the field behind us. And then I noticed at some point, and I started to play with his system to introduce a virtual structure, just improvising. Okay, so. But we're trying to instrument the air itself. And you'll see. I was doing this with the puppet, but the sound's coming from speakers, so the baby didn't look at the puppet. The baby was looking at me. He changed now. Change the sound. There's no recording. Nothing is recorded. Okay? It's a continuously generated synthesized texture of sound based on gesture, movement. And because, hey, he's playing Tinkerton music, I decided to say, okay, let's be a music box. So you, Katya, I didn't say anything, he's what I thought. Okay, let's make Katya the baby with it, and I will be the vocal. And I thought that maybe if I make a longer radius or walk faster, it will crank up the music. And indeed, let's see what happens. It's her baby. Okay. The point about this is no planning. I never had a conversation with Navid beforehand. I didn't even know she was coming with a baby. I didn't know that he had that kind of sound texture. I didn't know any of that. He didn't know what I was going to do, right? That's the whole point about this, is that it's not a game in the sense that there's a set of rules and states, and you can move from state to state in a certain determined way. You can even throw in some dice, but that doesn't change. It doesn't make it playful, okay? right? So this is what we're trying to do in all manners of built environment, you know, to have that kind of richness. So no matter what one does, the environment has a rich response, and how do you say, the meaningfulness is not in technology. The meaningfulness comes entirely from the contingent activity of the people in that situation. If it's not interesting, well, it's because I'm not doing something interesting. Okay, that's it. Okay, now, after a few years, David Morris came. He's the chair of philosophy at that point, a scholar from scholar of phenomenology of studies. And we did a 3-year project on memory, identity, and in relation to movement and how a body, let's say, gears itself into the world spatially. Okay. So there were about equal numbers of media artists and programmers and some philosophy students. And in this experiment, we're trying to do various simple Entfremdungs effect through body and hearing. So in that case, there's nothing to see. It's an acoustic experiment. We put headphones on one person and microphones on another person's head. So when the first person just stands, listening, the other person can walk around. So I will hear, if I'm this person standing, and you're walking, I will hear as if I were walking. So it's beautiful. It's actually a really wonderful experience and experiment. You should try it yourselves. Okay? You don't need a computer, just get a radio. Right? Put a mic on somebody's head and you listen to it from the other side. It's very helpful to be binaural, though. It is helpful to be binaural. Okay. Second experiment was put the microphones on the same head as the headphones, but send it out through radio to max MSP. We delayed it in MSP, a fixed number of milliseconds, send the sound back. So you hear things with a fixed delay, and we can vary the delay precisely. It's a trivial operation for our sound programmers, okay? But very interesting. And we knew what would happen, actually, because it's actually documented in the literature. So if it's many seconds delay, it's just somebody talking. It's my voice, right? But somebody else sounds just like me, but he's very rude. He's talking over me. But if it's 0 delay, it's me, a bit louder. If it's somewhere in between, like 50 to 100 milliseconds, it's a known effect. I start to stutter. It interferes with speech production. Okay, it's called the Lee effect. Very interesting. Okay, very interesting. And so the differencing in time has a very interesting effect on the organism. Okay, so this is the beginning of a phenomenological experiment. See, but very beginning. So we did a series of work beyond that point. Okay, all the time everybody was reading the literature, the appropriate literature. Okay, that was audio. This is visual with time delay. The way this works is every single pixel on the wall can be delayed a different number of milliseconds. It could be 0, it could be, what's the sound? Sound is not important, this one. So that's what's happening, okay? All right? So these are, and so you can pick a bunch of squares, it could be stripes, it could be gradients, what have you. And we have not exploited this to the full extent, even though we've had it for many, many years. In other words, we've not exploited it for experimental purposes. I think there's a lot more that can be done. But we did this work, with dancers. I think I showed this in the class, with dancers. And the dancers wanted to just put the whole wall at 6-second delay. And we were very disappointed. 6-second delay, that's trivial. I mean, it wasn't very interesting. I mean, it was interesting, actually, because for performance purposes, it was a lot of fun to be able to register your body into the wall with 6 seconds into the past. So you can come back and, engage yourself or use that to engage the other. Okay, fine. But here's the thing. If it's many seconds delay, and you look at, suppose it were a mirror, you look at yourself with 0 delay, it's a mirror. If you look at yourself and you see a 6-second delay, it's somebody else. It's really delayed, okay? So by calculus, in between, something must happen. Zero crossing logic, right? Something must happen. We don't know, actually. We never did that experiment. So what is that critical delay within which it becomes a question? Is this me or is this somebody else? Okay. And we're thinking of different things too, because David Morris has written an article on chirality after Kant, and thinking and conjecturing that maybe one's since chiral sense is actually constitutive of the sense of self. Technically, it's an easy thing to do, to flip. Actually, it's easy to do computationally. What's difficult is to make that mirror, make that screen feel like a piece of glass, like a mirror, the qualia of that, okay? That we have not solved. We have students who worked on this very well, very, very hard, okay? So it's not just a matter of computation to do that kind of experiment well. Another one, time. In this case, we're doing several years of seminars on time and temporality, so that's I'm sorry I could not attend Ellie's class, but I hope over the years to work through that bibliography you have. Maybe over 20 years I'll do a little bit, not 3 days, 20 years. So we were interested in a sense of time, temporality, not time, but sense of time, sense of change, dynamic, rhythm maybe. In this case, we want to make a media environment, a rich media environment, where things would happen, okay, but not according to a clock, not according to a regular computer clock, but of the media system itself were driven by activity, like breathing, the breath of this person, or in this case, not even that, by the flicker of the candle. So you will see in a minute this little tiny little performance event, which is like the inhalation and exhalation of the room, and in the blowing of the candle by the performer. But it's pushed ahead by the flicker of the candle itself, and you'll see on the wall those moving lights, which are themselves modulated by the flicker of the candle. So they're supposed to be like bodies and persona. Let me go back. It's very short. Here we go. Driven only by the light of the candle, the flicker of the candle. Okay, so there's no things scored, no time track, things like that. Oh, this is the delay. I showed it already in class, I'll skip this one. Okay. This experiment was about, okay, I will run it twice. What gives one a sense of stability on this floor? So when we walk into this room, probably none of us wondered whether the floor would give way. We just stepped into the floor, right? And also none of us wondered whether, well, maybe some of us did. Ordinarily, I wouldn't wonder if my leg will bear my weight, okay, unless I were injured, right? So this kinds of, but what would give you a sense of stability, even if you know that this is just a projected image, okay? And it's not the projection that gives the sense of precarity. But when I was on that floor, I was moving my foot underneath. There were sensors under the sand that were detecting very subtle shifts in my pressure, 4 of them, which then sent the data off to the sound synthesis, which was in real time constructing the crackle sound of ice. And then you're going to hear it now. And here we go. everybody slows down. Everybody. You know, it's just everybody hesitates. It's really funny. So why? Okay, why does it actually feel curious? And now, oh, I didn't do it this one. Okay, if you want, I'll just play a few moments. I'll repeat this, and I ask you to close your eyes. I'll just play a few moments. Close your eyes, and now let's do it again. It's even stronger if you are the one walking. First claim, it's about the delay structure. It's not about the visual. In fact, it's just a loop. That's fake. That's just the positional cracks. That's all. It's just a loop. The second is that it's a delay structure. It's a temporal structure of the clicks coming back, the pops coming back. Third, it's much stronger if it's correlated to your pressure, your movement of your body. Okay? That's it. These are very basic. Okay? Notice there's nothing in the computer that models the human being in the sense of what is your intention, who are you, whatever, what it thinks you're going to do. None of that. No learning, no machine learning, none of that. Okay? So that's part of the theme for, I find I talked about this in the class. Maybe tomorrow we'll say more. It's this thing about learning, this kind of obsession about having machine learn, or having machine predict, or having machine do judgment, this kind of thing. Okay, this doesn't try to do that kind of. We'll skip. Got that. Skip that. And I'll talk tomorrow about rhythm and rhythm analysis. I'll talk tomorrow about digital experience as some research projects. Okay, and also about working with being weather rather than looking at weather. So that's more related to. Hope to talk about that. Methods. Okay, so. I'll take about 10 minutes, something like that. Okay. So how? Methods. So again, like I said, it's about whole experience. So not about carving experience up into dimensions, this or that dimension. And especially important is trying to start these experiments without first having a strong theory for, what are the categories or what are the objects of study. Okay. We don't know. We may not know what's relevant. So we would say it's an abductive approach. Not inductive, it's an abductive approach to the phenomena. And we know already that the phenomena are going to be constructed in the course of the design of the experiment. Okay? Okay, so that's really important. Now, these categories, some of these categories, like a body, human body, matter, gesture, object, number, instead of thinking of these as objects of study, maybe we can think of these as contingent. And we can think that maybe because a body could be thought of as an effect of the activity or an effect of the experiment rather than a pre-given. Okay? I hope in this room there are people coming from the other program, coming from, let's say, movement arts, or I'd like to discuss these kinds of things with you. But it's not only for bodies, even number. So here's from our class. If you say this glass weighs whatever, I don't know, 200 grams or something. No, it's more than that, right? Okay, it's half a pound. So then, that's a number? No, it's an act of observation. How would you know that? How would I know that? I would have to put it on a scale and perform the act of measurement, right? This is why quantum mechanics is relevant. Not the QM itself, but the whole procedure. That one doesn't just say a number. When talking about properties of objects, one needs to go through an act of measurement, okay? And as Giuseppe Longo said in our seminar, at the beginning of the science, the first task is to decide what is measurable for your science. That means that you are also deciding what is not measurable, okay? So, but then that changes the emphasis to what is in a sense, the operators, the set of space of operators, the actions that one can take to establish this. So that's why I say number is bracketed. This is also credit to people like Vera Bürmann in the ETH in Zurich. Okay. So let me skip past these things. We're running out of time. Oh, I'll just mention, it's about whole experiences. Doesn't mean it's messy, but it is about the thickness of experience, empowering or reappropriating or appropriating whatever gives a sense of thick, not for description, but for inaction. Okay. Questioning the body, putting into question what is a gesture, and with an aim toward coming up with techniques for investigating certain questions from a non-anthropocentric point of view. Okay, this is a fairly abstract framing of it. I'll give you maybe a more concrete framing in a minute. But so instead of thinking about cognition, one can think about sense, right? So instead of thinking about objects, think about the substrates within or within which objects are shaped. So an example for that would be the watermark. I use this. So normally you can think of a mark, like a piece of word, printed word, as ink on paper. So applying one bit of matter to another bit of matter. So the kind of background and foreground. But instead, consider the watermark. A watermark is a variation of intensity of matter, such that one discerns the less dense part of matter as a form. It's very nice. I just think of this as a very, very helpful way to think about kind of a non-hieromorphic approach, right, to shaping. Also to Simondon's notion of information, Gilbert Simondon's notion of information. Okay. And instead of thinking about meaning, let's say, can we think in terms of subsemantic analysis, which in the engineering field is known as signal processing. Signal processing. Okay. And we've already done this. And from Whitehead, this idea that we can think in terms of, instead of thinking about what are the objects of the world, what are the object of the situation, in other words, taking that kind of computer science version of ontology, and then defining all these techniques or tools, et cetera, that apply to these objects, that are properties of the objects, that can be used to work with the properties of the objects. We can maybe be guided by or inspired by this very compact description of process philosophy or processual philosophy, how an object becomes constitutes what that entity is. Okay. It's very helpful. It's very helpful. So for 20 years, I've been saying to the people in these labs, say, look, instead of thinking about things or people, whatever, let's think about transformations of things, the spaces of transformations of things, the spaces of the way that things can be changed. Okay. So it's this thing about putting in play all these different kinds of objects, even the studio itself, even the lab itself, making that an object of play, a question, and how these get formed. So I think I'll skip past some of the seminars we've been doing along the way. And, oh, here they are. Here's some of the seminars along the way. I'd like to make a pitch for the last two items, rhythm and ontogenesis, because I'd like to propose with some of you here, if you're interested, that we begin to extend this conversation or connect up with other conversations, one on a multi-scale study of rhythm, borrowing the flag from Lefebvre, a multi-scale approach to the study of rhythm at many different scales. Scale of media, which would be milliseconds, gestures, fractions of a second, organizations, could be weeks and days, weeks and months, and cities, generations. Okay. And then the other project is a project with people such as Giuseppe Longo and Stu Kaufman, a project on study of evolution, dynamic ontogenesis, without trying to just reduce it to computational or physics, computational science or physics. Okay, thank you very much.